Did ancient Ireland have a law for bees? Well, thank the Eve agus Fáilte. Hi, hello, and welcome. Jon O'Sullivan, Irish Pagan School here. And I am doing a bit of a series where I explore the ancient laws of Ireland, known as the Brehon Laws. They're called the Brehon Laws because Brehon was the Old Irish for judge, and the Brehons were a subcaste of Druid. Within ancient Irish, very structured, very organized society, we did have very clear guidelines, very extensive and practical laws that applied not just within one particular tribe or tuath, but across all tribes and tuath, and that is the Brehon Laws. So it really does show that before Ireland was conquered, invaded, colonized by other people, we weren't some collection of barbarian savages. We had very clear, very detailed, very extensive rule of law. And it wasn't punitive law, it was restorative law. The justice was not about taking people's lives or like incarceration or dismemberment. It was about making right for loss, quantifying what a loss would be, and then the person who created that loss is then responsible for making right by that so that the other individual who suffered the loss is not left without. And so that is the whole concept of restorative justice within the Brehon laws. And so I'm doing many a short hop through the very extensive, very detailed laws of ancient Ireland. And today we're going to look at bees. So, neat answer, not hard to say. Yes, in ancient Ireland, we had laws around bees, beekeeping, bee farming, and also bee injury. So, when we look for this information, we go to a 7th century source known as the Brehon Law. And the Brehon Law translates from Old Irish as the law of neighborhoods. So, in this law of neighborhoods, it talks about people creating farm territory, like setting up their areas around each other and, being in community. And of course, as people establish property next to each other, there is going to be times when something goes awry or something doesn't work out. And that's where the law comes in and has to make very detailed decisions about what is a loss, how it's quantified, and how it's then paid back. Because, as I said, all of this was covered by dire or dirt, which was translated as a fine or a fee. So the most common unit of fee was milch cow, which was a one milch cow. So if, for example, you did harm to a tree in someone else's property by, cutting off like core branches or even damage to the root, the main trunk of the tree, then you would have to pay milk cows, a cow that gives milk, which very, very wealthy, very, very important to the agricultural culture of ancient Ireland. And of course, if it was one of the more valuable trees, you might have to pay more than just one cow. So I'm not talking about trees. I did a video on trees. If you're interested in that, you can find it on the channel. But we're here on bees. And so the reason why Burha this farming neighborhood law structure covers bees, is bees are considered in the same category as animal property and cultivation. So if you are keeping cattle, raising pigs, raising sheep, if you're keeping bees, they're treated the same as any of those other animals, which is absolutely fascinating. So within this Brehon law, as I said, dates to the 7th century. We know it's old manuscripts. There is also an extra subsection known as the Bechbretha, which is the law about bees specifically. So in the Bechbretha, it breaks down the obligations and onuses around bees. Now, when you're looking at things from a legal circumstance, if, say, a cow breaks through a fence or there's a cow break into a neighboring field, they graze off the field, there's very clear damage. And so that's resolved after the fact once the damage is quantified. But how do you quantify for bees? How do you quantify for bees which fly and roam across all of the territory? They don't accept or acknowledge fences or boundaries or guards at all. So, how do you account for that? The way they did it was by offering what's known as a targaille or a fore-pledge. So, if a person wants to keep or cultivate bees, they would need to go to their next nearest neighbors, the four next nearest neighbors in all directions, and give them a promise or an oath or a fore-pledge, a targaille. And a targaille was an agreement that for the first 3 years of the person keeping bees, they are immune from any concerns or recompenses or claims against them. But come the fourth year, that person who's keeping the bees then needs to gift a swarm to the next nearest neighbors. So not only does it look at the cultivation and keeping of bees, it also acknowledges the life cycles of the bees themselves. So someone goes and starts to keep a hive. For the first year, the hive is establishing itself. For the second year, it's only beginning to cultivate its own resources. It's only after the third year that the population has grown enough that it could possibly potentially swarm and then break off into other areas. And so the oathing and the ownership for this targaille, this fore-pledge, is that, I'm your neighbor, I'm going to keep bees. 4 years from now, the next nearest neighbor is going to get a hive. And it actually goes down and it quantifies the order in which the neighbors get the hives. So just because someone has the largest territory near you, that may not mean it's the most cultivated or the most likely to attract the bees. So if one person just has open pasture land, they're keeping sheep or grazing cattle, yeah, they're going to have some bee incursion, shall we say, into their territory. But if a person with a smaller territory is growing crop or cereals, then they're more likely to have bee incursion. And so just because someone has more land doesn't mean that they're going to actually get the bee swarm. It does come down to what is the quantifiable value of the land and its use. And that is set out at the very beginning. That is set out 4 years in advance during this targaille, during this agreement between next nearest neighbors to say, okay, well, you're cultivating crops, the first swarm goes to you, your pasture land, next swarm goes to you, and that's how it goes down the train. And it very clearly acknowledges not just volume, but also value and use when it comes to bee and bee propagation around those areas and the next nearest neighbors. Now, it goes a little bit further than that as well, though, because it's possible that a bee may escape. So a bee swarm could actually happen, and there were people, if you noticed, if you were keeping bees and you noticed that a swarm was leaving your territory, you had to hire someone. You had to actually get someone, be they one of your own people, one of your tribe unity, or employ someone to follow the hives, to follow the swarms. And so if a swarm leaves your territory and goes into another person's territory, the person you employ to follow that swarm comes back and says, okay, well, this is where they've nested down, this is where they are, and I can oath that these are the bees that left your property. Because it did actually quantify strangers or people just coming across stray swarms of bees in various places in Ireland. And I have put out an excerpt to it, and I'm going to actually read this out to you because it is so fascinating how detailed they go into it. So it says, the man who finds a stray swarm of bees on a lawful green, the extent of a lawful green in Irish law is as far as the sound of a bell or the crowing of a cock reaches. So it actually defines that this is a green area owned by someone, which is the range of a bell ringing. It gives a claim to 1/4 of its produce for a year to the man who finds it, and the other 3/4 go to the owner of the green where it was found. So this means a random person out and about, they find a swarm nested down somewhere. They then go report that swarm. If no one else has reported it, they get a quarter. They get a section of the bee. They get a quarter of the produce from that bee. They get honey. They get paid for having found and notified that that bee was there. But the swarm, the nesting swarm in that area, 3/4 of the produce goes to the person whose territory it's in. But it does then go further because that's on a lawful green. A man who finds a stray swarm, if it's outside of a green, up to a great forest or inaccessible country or shared land, 1/3 goes to the man who finds it, and 2/3 go to the owner of the land where it is found. So if it's not a green, not a pasture land, not an open area, if it's actually just in a forested area or some site like up country in a mountain, you can still claim that you have found that bee swarm, and the person who owns that territory, inaccessible as it might be, they go on harvest and then you come and collect your third for having found the fact that the bees were in their territory. And then lastly, of course, a man who finds a stray swarm in a forest or unshared land or inaccessible country, is immune for him, for it is for one of the complete immunities of Irish law, except for the share of the chief and the kindred or the share of the church to which that person is bequeathed. So this language being a little bit clunky because it is a legal text, essentially, if you find a swarm of bees that are nested in an area that's inaccessible, upcountry, shared land, or not owned by anyone else, you claim the hive. It is now yours. They are your bees. So you are now falling under that 3 year immunity for any kind of difficulty because they are now your bees. Except for any tithing or offer, like if you are a layperson who's part of a tuath or a tribe, you would have a personal onus to make payments to either your church, if because some of this is influenced by early Irish monks who are writing down in these, like the Christian kind of church moved in 400 Common Era, but not as established when later on they colonization conversation in a different video if you're interested. But this Breha Comacasa coming from the 7th century, it is documented by early Christian monks, but it's still under the Irish law system. It's still under Irish tribal law structure. And so a person, the individual being part of a tuath, part of a tribe, has an onus of payment to their chieftains, to the top end people in their social structure, in their living structure. But then also, this is where the church kind of shoves their part in. Oh well, yeah. Also, you have to give a bit to the church. But again, if you find a swarm in no man's land in this area that's not claimed by anyone else, it's now your swarm of bees, and you're entitled to claim all of the honey from it, minus your whatever you have to pay to your kind of tribal onuses or taxation, essentially. So it means that the breakdown of all of this legal structure around bees was acknowledging how important they were culturally, that everyone eventually, like if you start keeping bees and you have a promise that you have to give your four next nearest neighbors bees, the moment they get their bee swarm from you, the moment you kind of nest them over after your 4 years, they now own bees. And so they have 3 years worth of immunity for their bees. But after 4 years, they have to give a hive of bees to their next neighbors, who then have 3 years of immunity, but they then have to give a hive of bees to their next neighbors. So suddenly, within this Irish law structure, it's not just about, okay, well, I have bees and I'm the honey producer. Everyone eventually gets bees. Which now, like looking at this ancient past that we have, our ancestors knew the importance of bees. They knew the timeline of bees looking after themselves, growing, and then propagating to the point of swarm being 4 years, which is why there was that immunity in place. But then also that everyone eventually gets bees because bees are part of an agricultural circumstance, they're part of a process, and they themselves are producers. They are a what's it? Oh, I've gone and lost the words. They are a commodity in a way, but they are a collection of creatures, much like milk cows, who produce something that is of huge value to the tribe and to the tuath. Because again, wax from the hives, used for preservations, used for candles, used for all other purposes. Honey from the hives, coarse food, food preservation, the creation of mead made from honey. So the role of bees within tribal structure so very important. Now, I did mention that there was a section of law around bee harm or bee injury, so I will loop into that because it is absolutely fascinating. So they talk about damage from bees. So it's possible that if you get stung by a bee, you can prove where that bee comes from. You can claim damages for the harm that's been done upon you by the bees because the bees are cattle in essence owned by someone or property owned by someone, unless you're standing over the hive during a swarm, or if you're in the territory of that person where you're not supposed to be, if you're trespassing, the law of trespass applies, or if you're trying to steal, it actually lists out if you're trying to rob from the hive and you get stung, you have no rights. I'm sorry. But it actually then goes on to clarify if you are walking past or you're in the area near someone else's land and you get stung by a bee, you then could have grounds to claim compensation on the understanding that you don't kill the bee, Because if you get stung by a bee and that you kill the bee, then essentially the bee has paid for the transgression with its life. So therefore you can't claim. But if you get stung by a bee, you do not kill the bee. You can then show an oath where the bee came from. You have a right to claim compensation for the harm done to you. And there is a usage case. There's a clear usage case which is documented in this Bechbretha, in this law of bees. And so it says, um, if it is in the eye, so a person who gets blinded, because that's fairly significant, if it be in the eye which it has blinded, it is then that the injury requires the casting of lots over all of the hives. Whichever of the hives it falls upon is forfeit for its bees offended or the results of the offense. So again, it's hard to say which bee came from which hive, but they cast lots over all of the bees, and wherever the lots come down, this is the hive that is now forfeit, that is then given to the person who suffered the wound. For this is the first judgment which was passed in regards to the offences of the bees on Congal the One-Eyed, who bees blinded in his one eye, and he was the king in Tara until this wounding put him from his kingship. So there was a whole rule of law, a structured rule of law, as I said, very, very important, very tiered society, at the top end of which was, of course, your chieftain or king, but then also there were over kings who kind of had rulership or rights across multiple Tua, and then there was higher kings again. And so this individual is supposed to be a paragon, a representation of the people. So anyone who suffers harm or injury, has some kind of wounding placed against them, are no longer fit to sit the seat of the king. And so in this instance, not only do we have the offense, the listing of it, but who it was. And it's Congal, who then became known as the One-Eyed because he was blinded by a bee and it cost him his kingship. And so the lots were cast over the hives, and he got a hive to then move on with the rest of his life. Now, he was probably part of an upper echelon, an upper structure of society. He probably didn't get cast out of society. It just meant that he was no longer fit to sit the seat of the king. So this is absolutely amazing and absolutely fascinating. The law of bees being so extensive really shows the insight into the culture, the insight into the awareness of the growing agricultural nature or the extensive agricultural nature of early Ireland. So it's no wonder that we were an absolutely beautiful, bountiful island that other people came to try and take, conquer, and use for their own profits. So yes, hopefully you have found this interesting. I will be doing more videos on this as I dive into early Irish law. My guide on this is this amazing book I'm holding up right now. It is a guide to early Irish law written by Fergus Kelly. So I will be going through that as well as other references as I can and bring you some insights and interesting, hopefully hops through Irish law and give you an idea on what Ireland was like before we were colonized. So if you would like to know more, do make sure you're following along with the series. Check out more of the videos here in YouTube. And as ever, irishpagan.school/free. You'll find a whole load of free resources there. Listings, classes, teachings, blog posts, more videos, more podcasts to follow, and even guided meditations if you're interested in exploring not just Irish history, but also Irish spirituality. Until next time, look after yourself. Take care. Uncle Slán. Goodbye.